The 43rd floor of Von Dynamics never slept. Even at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, the open-plan office hummed with the low white noise of servers, the soft percussion of keyboards, and the distant chime of elevator doors. Isabella Vaughn liked it this way. She liked the building when it was emptied of its daytime noise, the performance reviews, the product launches, the board presentations that required her to perform a version of herself she sometimes barely recognized. At 36, Isabella had built Von Dynamics, from a two-person startup operating out of a sub-level office in downtown Chicago, into a publicly traded artificial intelligence firm with 400 employees, offices on 3 continents, and a market cap that financial journalists like to describe using words like staggering and unprecedented. She wore her success with the same precision she wore her clothing. Nothing excessive, nothing accidental, every detail intentional. She was reviewing a procurement contract at her standing desk when she noticed him. The man was pushing a cleaning cart through the hall outside her glass-walled office. He moved slowly, not out of laziness, she sensed, but out of habit, the unhurried pace of someone accustomed to being invisible. He wore the gray uniform of the building's contracted janitorial service, the Von Dynamics emblem on the chest pocket. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that spoke of not quite enough meals rather than deliberate discipline. What caught her attention was the notebook. He had stopped beside the door to conference room C, one of the rooms with restricted keycard access, and was writing something in a small, wire-bound notebook. He held the pen in his left hand, writing quickly, then looked up at the access panel beside the door. Then he wrote again. Isabella watched him for a full 30 seconds before her gaze returned to the procurement contract. She told herself it meant nothing. The next morning she asked her executive assistant, Dana Whitmore, to pull the personnel file on the night shift janitorial staff. Any particular reason? Dana asked. Dana was 29, relentlessly efficient, and had learned not to ask follow-up questions when Isabella's voice carried a certain flatness. Routine review, Isabella said. The files arrived by noon. 7 members of the contracted cleaning crew held regular overnight clearance passes for the building. Isabella scanned each one. When she reached the 6th, she paused. Marcus Hale. Age 34. Contracted through Pinnacle Facility Services. Employment start date 8 months prior. The photograph showed the same man she had seen in the hallway. Sharp features, steady eyes, the kind of face that gave nothing away unless you looked carefully. She set the file on her desk and turned back to her work. But that evening, when she stayed late again as she almost always did, she saw him again. This time he was in the server corridor on the 41st floor, a restricted access hallway that required a level 3 clearance badge. His cart was parked at the end of the hall. He was not cleaning. He was standing beside a ventilation panel, holding his notebook open, writing steadily. Isabella stepped back into the elevator alcove before he turned around. Her head of security, Ray Donahue, was waiting for her call. I need you to pull the access logs for the 41st floor server corridor, she said. The past 30 days. Anyone specific? Badge number, Jan 006. And I want camera footage from any hallway he's been in after 11 p.m. There was a brief pause on Ray's end. That's the overnight janitor, Marcus Hale. He's been clean since we brought his crew on. I didn't say he wasn't, Isabella said. I said I want the footage. She ended the call and stood at her window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. 43 floors below, the city moved with its usual indifferent energy. The notebook bothered her. Not because she had seen anything explicitly wrong. But in 11 years of running a company, Isabella had learned that her instincts were worth more than most people's analysis, and something about the way Marcus Hale stood alone in restricted hallways, writing things down in careful silence, felt like a question that needed an answer. By Friday, Ray had delivered his report. In the previous 30 days, Marcus Hale had accessed 6 restricted zones during his overnight shift. The building system flagged this as within permissible range. Cleaning crews were granted wide area access to do their jobs. But Ray had added a handwritten note at the bottom of the report. Camera footage shows subject pausing at system access points on multiple occasions. Duration of pauses inconsistent with standard cleaning protocols. Dana stopped in the doorway of Isabella's office as she was reading the report for the second time. "The security team is asking whether you want to flag this with HR," she said. Isabella looked up. "Not yet. Should I be worried?" "Not yet," Isabella said again. Then, after a moment, "Pull his full background. Anything before Pinnacle." She wanted to know who Marcus Hale had been before he became invisible. Marcus Hale's apartment was on the third floor of a building in Pilsen that smelled of old wood and someone else's cooking. The hallway light on his floor had been out for 2 weeks. He had reported it to the building manager twice. He came home at 7:30 in the morning, when his daughter's school bus had already come and gone. He had arranged with his neighbor, Helen Marsh, a retired teacher whose kindness was the kind that asked for nothing in return, to get Lily to the bus stop on the mornings he was working nights. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room window that faced a brick wall. On a good day, the light came in sideways for about 40 minutes in the late afternoon. Lily called it the golden hour and had positioned her drawing table directly in its path. Marcus changed out of his uniform, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. The notebook was not what Isabella Vaughn's security team thought it was. It had begun 6 weeks into his job at Vaughan Dynamics, when he had been cleaning the server corridor on the 41st floor and noticed something that should not have been there. A secondary network cable had been run along the baseboards beneath the primary routing rack, not in the cable management system, not labeled, not visible unless you were on your hands and knees with a floor brush. Marcus had been on his hands and knees with a floor brush. He had a degree in network systems engineering from the University of Illinois. He had spent 9 years working in enterprise cybersecurity before everything fell apart. He knew what unlabeled secondary cables in server corridors meant. And it wasn't good. He had written it down because writing things down was how his mind worked. He wrote down everything he noticed: the access panel on the 43rd floor, whose keypad had a worn pattern on 3 of its digits, suggesting the same short code had been used for years. The gap in the camera coverage in the east stairwell on the 38th floor. The way the ventilation system on the server level ran slightly hotter than the ambient temperature suggested it should, which could indicate something drawing unexpected power. He had written all of it down, and he had done nothing with it. Not because he didn't care, because he had been here before. At his previous position, a network security role at a financial services firm called Clearwater Data, he had discovered evidence that a senior executive was siphoning client funds through a shell of rerouted digital transactions. He had documented everything. He had gone to HR. He had then gone to the board. He had then gone to the FBI. Because the board had called the executive's attorney instead of the investigators. The executive had survived. Marcus had not. It had taken 18 months, 2 attorneys, and the complete dissolution of his professional reputation before the charges against him fabricated. Every one of them were quietly dropped. By then, Clearwater had settled with the regulatory bodies. The executive had retired with a full package. And Marcus had spent 4 months unable to find work in any field adjacent to his experience. His daughter, Lily, had been diagnosed with a congenital heart defect 18 months before all of this. The surgery she needed cost more than Marcus had made in 2 years at Clearwater, and it was not the kind of thing that waited. He had taken the janitorial job because Pinnacle Facility Services offered health insurance after 60 days of employment. It was the best option he could find that offered coverage fast enough to matter. He sipped his coffee and looked at the notebook. He had spent the early weeks of this job trying to determine the appropriate threshold. How much did you need to see before you had an obligation to speak? How certain did you need to be? He had run this calculation at Clearwater, and he had concluded too early had gone to HR with documentation that was solid but not invulnerable, and had discovered that solid was not enough when the person you were reporting had spent 7 years cultivating relationships that Marcus had not known existed. He had been naive about power. He understood that now in a way that had cost him significantly, but he was also aware, sitting in his kitchen, listening to the pigeons on the building's exterior ledge, watching the gray light soften through the window, that there was a version of caution that was just cowardice, dressed in reasonable language. That waiting for perfect proof was sometimes a way of never doing anything at all. That he would report it through proper channels when he had enough evidence to be impossible to dismiss. That this time, he would not make the mistake of speaking before he had proof that could not be buried. But sitting in his kitchen on a gray November morning, he was honest with himself about what he was really afraid of. That he would speak and lose the job and lose the insurance, and Lily would not get her surgery. He closed the notebook and went to sleep. He did not know that by the end of the week, Isabella Vaughn would have read everything his former employer had ever written about him, and that the reading would leave her more uncertain, not less. The background report arrived Thursday morning, and Dana placed it on Isabella's desk without comment. Isabella read it straight through. Marcus Hale had graduated with honors from the University of Illinois. He had spent 4 years at a boutique cybersecurity firm in Milwaukee before moving to a senior network security role at Clearwater Data in Chicago. His performance reviews at both positions were exceptional. He had held certifications that took most people in the field years to accumulate. Then the Clearwater incident, a disciplinary action that had been subsequently vacated, an internal investigation that had, according to a single line buried near the back of the file, been opened at the request of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC had later reached a settlement with Clearwater. The terms were not public. Isabella sat with this information for a long moment. Then she called Ray Donahue. "I want to speak with him," she said. "Tonight," quietly. She found him at 11:15 in the hallway outside the 41st floor stairwell. He was mopping in long, even strokes, working from the wall outward, the way people did when they had stopped thinking about what they were doing, because the motion had become its own kind of thinking. "Mr. Hale." He stopped. He turned. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than she had expected. Not fear, not guilt, not the defensive posturing she had prepared herself for, just a kind of tired recognition, as if he had been expecting this conversation, and was mildly relieved it had arrived. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "I'd like to talk with you." "All right." She had planned to conduct the conversation in her office, on her territory, with the implicit authority of the setting behind her. Instead, she found herself standing in the hallway while he set his mop in the bucket and waited. "You've been documenting things in this building," she said. "Yes." The directness surprised her. "What kind of things?" "Security vulnerabilities." He said it flatly, without emphasis, as if he were reporting the weather. "I found a secondary network cable in the server corridor about 6 weeks ago, unlabeled, running parallel to the primary routing rack. Since then I've noticed a few other things. A keypad with a compromised access code. A camera blind spot on 38. A thermal signature anomaly in the server ventilation that suggests unauthorized hardware." Isabella studied him. "Why didn't you report this?" Something shifted behind his eyes, but his face stayed neutral. "I tried," he said. "About 3 weeks ago. I mentioned the cable to one of your network engineers, in passing. He told me the maintenance team had probably run it during an upgrade, and I should mind my own business. She did not remember this being reported to her. She would check. You should have come directly to security, she said. I'm a janitor, he said. It was not self-pity. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had learned exactly how the world categorized people, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Your head of security is Ray Donahue. He runs a team of 12. I push a cart. If I walk into his office and tell him I think your network has been compromised, what happens? Isabella did not answer because she already knew the answer. I wanted to have enough that it couldn't be dismissed, he said. That's why I kept writing it down. She looked at him for a long moment. Everything about his manner was consistent with someone telling the truth. That, paradoxically, made her more cautious rather than less. I'm going to need that notebook, she said. I know. He reached into the front pocket of his cart and handed it to her. She opened it. The handwriting was small and precise, the entries dated and organized, diagrams, access codes, cable routing sketches, a timeline of anomalies going back 6 weeks. Each entry methodical, each detail specific. This was not the work of someone selling information. This was the work of an engineer. "Go home, Mr. Hale," she said. "I'll be in touch." She went back to her office and called Ray Donahue, who arrived in 20 minutes looking mildly annoyed at the hour. She handed him the notebook. He read through it in silence. His expression during the reading went through several phases: initial skepticism, then concentration, then something that looked uncomfortably like concern. Ray Donahue was not easily concerned. He had spent 12 years in corporate security and had, in that time, developed the calm of someone who had seen most varieties of crisis and understood that panic was never a useful response. He looked up. His expression had changed. "If even half of this is accurate," he said, "we have a serious problem." "I know," Isabella said. "The thermal signature alone, I know. The unlabeled cable is either a contractor error or deliberate placement. There's no third option." He set the notebook on her desk carefully, as if it were something that needed to be handled with respect. "Either way, we need to send a physical team into that server corridor tonight." "Tonight," Isabella confirmed. Ray picked up his phone. "I'll go myself." She turned back to her window. Somewhere below, a cleaning cart was being pushed through an empty hallway by a man who had seen exactly what was happening and had written it all down because he'd learned the hard way that nobody believed you until you had proof they couldn't. Ignore. At 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, the first alarm triggered. The breach began in the 41st floor server infrastructure. By 2:30 a.m., 3 of Von Dynamics' primary data partitions had been isolated. By 3 a.m., the company's client-facing platforms had gone offline. By 3:15, Ray Donahue's team had been unable to identify the intrusion vector, despite running 3 separate diagnostic sweeps that each returned the same baffling absence of a clear origin point. Isabella stood in the operations center on the 39th floor and watched her engineers work with the focused silence of people doing their best and knowing it wasn't going to be enough. The operations center was a long room with low ceilings and the particular quality of artificial light that made everyone look slightly unwell. 8 workstations ran in 2 parallel rows. Every screen was active. The air smelled of cold coffee and the particular tension of a room where no one had said aloud what everyone was thinking, which was that they were losing. "We need to bring in external consultants," her chief technology officer, Brian Walsh, said. He was a careful man, methodical, the kind of person who handled routine complexity with impressive competence. "This was not routine complexity. I can have a team here by 6 a.m. "Call them," Isabella said. Then, "Brian, the notebook I sent you an hour ago." Walsh had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I've been reviewing it. The thermal signature in server ventilation. The unlabeled cable. Yes. What would an unlabeled cable in that position allow someone to do?" Walsh was quiet for 3 seconds. In the language of engineers, 3 seconds of silence meant the answer was not a comfortable one. It would allow someone with the right credentials to establish a secondary access pathway, he said carefully, one that bypasses standard monitoring. Essentially, a shadow channel. Anything routed through it would be invisible to our normal traffic analysis, which is exactly what happened tonight. "It appears so." She heard in his voice the thing he was not saying, that this had been in the notebook for more than 3 weeks, and that no one had physically verified it, because no one had taken the notebook seriously enough to act on it in the 24 hours since she had received it. She did not say this out loud. There would be time for that conversation. This was not that time. Isabella picked up her phone and called Marcus Hale. He answered on the second ring. "You're awake," she said. "I don't sleep much," he said. There was the sound of a coffee maker in the background. And then the particular quality of stillness that meant he was in a small apartment and had not turned on the television. "We've had a breach. It matches the pattern in your notebook." Silence. Then, "How bad?" 3 partitions down. Platform offline. "We can't locate the entry point." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had changed not dramatically, but she heard it. the shift from civilian to something else. It was the sound of a person stepping back into something they had never entirely left. The secondary cable, I flagged. Did your team inspect it after I gave you the notebook? Ray pulled the schematics. He couldn't send a physical team until morning. The cable gives someone a shadow route, Marcus said. If they've been building access quietly over 6 weeks, they've had time to install something that can survive a standard intrusion sweep. It won't show on your normal monitoring because it's routing through a system your monitoring assumes is inactive. Your diagnostic is looking in the right place with the wrong assumptions about what should be there. There was the sound of him putting down the coffee cup. Can you stop it? The pause this time was different, heavier. Not the pause of uncertainty, but of a person making a calculation that involved more than just the technical problem. Mr. Hale, can you stop it? If I can get into the server room, he said. And if the physical access point is still intact, not yet burned, yes. I can interrupt the shadow route manually. It'll take time your systems don't have in the normal playbook. But it can be done. Another pause. It's going to look strange. The method I'd use is about 20 years old. It's the kind of thing you do when you can't trust the automated systems to give you an accurate picture of what's happening. That's fine, Isabella said. It's not how your team will expect it to be done. Mr. Hale. Her voice was quiet and precise. Come back to the building. I'll have a badge waiting. He arrived at 12 minutes past 4, in jeans and a gray sweatshirt, carrying a small canvas bag. Ray Donahue met him in the lobby with a temporary access badge and the visible skepticism of a man who had built his career on professional credentials and was now being asked to stand aside for a janitor. Isabella met them at the elevator. My team is still working, Ray said. We don't need— Your team has been working for 2 hours, Isabella said. And we still don't know where the entry point is. Mr. Hale knew it 6 weeks ago. She looked at Marcus. Walk me through it. They rode the elevator to the 41st floor in silence. Marcus moved through the server corridor with the confidence of someone who had memorized its dimensions by hand, which, Isabella realized, he had. He had cleaned this corridor dozens of times in the past 8 months, and he had paid attention every time. He stopped at the routing rack in the northeast corner and crouched down. The cable was there, exactly where his notebook said it would be. They ran this during a maintenance window, he said, not looking up. Your logs would show routine hardware work that day. Whoever approved the maintenance request either didn't know what they were approving, or did. That stopped everyone in the room. Someone on the inside, Ray said. Someone with access to the maintenance scheduling system and enough authority to get a physical crew into the server room without raising flags. Marcus stood up. The cable terminates at a hardware node about 6 feet above the false ceiling in this sector. I'm guessing. I've never been above the ceiling. But the thermal signature suggests something drawing power up there. Isabella looked at Ray. Ray looked at the ceiling. He called in 2 of his engineers. 8 minutes later, they found it. A small, matte black device, no larger than a hardback novel, attached to the structural framing above the server room's acoustic tile. It had been there for at least a month, based on the dust pattern around its mounting brackets. One of the engineers, a young woman named Claire Stanton, who had joined the security team 14 months ago, and had the particular brilliance of someone who had learned to hide it, crouched beside the device and examined it without touching it. It's a bridge, she said, a passive one. It doesn't transmit, it creates a mirror. Every packet moving through this rack has been copied, in real time, to wherever this thing sends it. The room was very quiet. 6 weeks, Marcus said. That's how long it's been running. Isabella counted back. 6 weeks ago, Vaughn Dynamics had been in the final stages of negotiating a joint venture with 3 separate federal infrastructure partners. The kind of negotiation where data security was not a preference, but a contractual obligation. The kind of negotiation where a 6-week mirror of internal communications would be worth, to the right buyer, an extraordinary amount of money. Who authorized the maintenance window? She said. Ray was already on his phone. The maintenance authorization had been signed by Gregory Marsh, Vaughn Dynamics' chief operating officer. Gregory Marsh, who had been with the company for 7 years. who had helped Isabella structure the board presentation that had taken the company public, who had a corner office on the 44th floor, and a reputation for being the most dependable person in the building. Isabella sat with this information for longer than she let anyone see. Gregory had been her hire, her recommendation, her trust. Ray's team had pulled the full documentation trail by 6 a.m. The maintenance authorization, the communications between Marsh's corporate account and an external server that had subsequently been traced to a competitor firm headquartered in Singapore. A wire transfer of $200,000 to an account in Marsh's wife's maiden name, dated 3 days after the maintenance window. "It's comprehensive," Ray said. He was careful. But he wasn't careful enough. He wasn't careful enough because he assumed nobody would be looking from below the floor, Marcus said quietly. He was sitting in a chair at the edge of the operations center, holding a paper cup of coffee that one of the engineers had brought him. He looked exhausted in the way that came from years of accumulation, rather than a single hard night. Isabella looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means he was careful about his digital footprint," Marcus said. "He covered the network traces. He structured the wire transfer, but he didn't think about the fact that someone cleaning the floor might notice a cable that didn't belong." He turned the paper cup in his hands. People with authority usually don't. By 9 a.m., Gregory Marsh had been asked to remain in his office, pending an internal investigation. By 10, federal investigators had been contacted. By 11, Marsh had retained counsel and stopped speaking. The breach itself had been contained before dawn, using a combination of Marcus's identification of the hardware bridge and Claire Stanton's work to isolate the affected partitions. The data that had been mirrored over the previous 6 weeks could not be unmirrored. That was the damage that would take longer to assess. But the intrusion had been stopped. Vaughn Dynamics systems came back online at 7:48 a.m. Isabella stood at her office window and watched the city brighten into full daylight. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She was aware of both of these things and was not, at this moment, doing anything about either of them. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the 3 weeks during which Marcus Hale had possessed specific, accurate documentation of the precise vulnerabilities that had just nearly destroyed her company and had not been able to get anyone to listen to him. She thought about what it cost to be right when nobody believed you. 3 days after the breach, Isabella drove herself to the University of Chicago Medical Center. She had looked up Lily Hale's case through the company's health insurance records, a use of administrative access that she knew was borderline and did not entirely justify to herself. She told herself she was ensuring that an employee's dependent was receiving adequate care. She suspected the truth was simpler than that. The pediatric cardiology ward was on the 6th floor. The waiting area outside the unit had a mural of blue and yellow birds on the wall and chairs that were slightly too small for adults. Marcus was in one of them when she arrived, sitting with the posture of someone who had spent a lot of hours in waiting room chairs. He had a book open in his lap, but was not reading it. He looked up when she appeared. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession before settling into something cautious. "Miss Vaughn, I should have called," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't say it unkindly. She sat down in the chair beside him, which was also too small. "How is she?" "Stable. She had a procedure 2 days ago. Minor, in the relative sense." He closed the book. "They need to do the full surgery before spring. Her cardiologist says the window closes as she gets older. The insurance covers the surgery, 70%. He said it without bitterness, with the flat precision of someone who had run this calculation many times. The other 30% is approximately $40,000. Isabella looked at the mural. The birds were mid-flight, caught in the permanent optimism of painted things. "I owe you an apology," she said. The silence that followed was long enough to be honest. "You thought I was a threat," he said. "You were protecting what you'd built. I understand that. I didn't give you a fair hearing." "No," he said. "You didn't." He paused. "But you listened eventually. And you came back." He looked at the door to the ward. "A lot of people don't." A nurse came out to speak with him briefly, something about a medication schedule, a follow-up with the attending physician in the afternoon. Marcus listened with total focus, asking 2 precise questions, and noting the answers in a small notebook he pulled from his jacket pocket. Isabella watched him and said nothing. When the nurse left, Marcus turned back to her. What happens now? With Marsh, federal investigators. A civil suit will follow, almost certainly. The board is in emergency session today. She paused. The joint venture partners are understandably concerned. We have a great deal of rebuilding to do. The systems are stable. Claire Stanton has run 3 independent audits in the past 72 hours. We're clean. She looked at him. She said you taught her 3 things in the server room that her 4 years of formal training hadn't covered. He almost smiled. It was brief and complicated. The smile of someone who had learned to be careful with hope. She's sharp, he said. She would have found it herself. Maybe, Isabella said. But you found it 6 weeks earlier. What she did not tell Marcus at the hospital was that the board meeting that afternoon had not gone the way she had intended. The 4 independent directors, shaken by the breach and the revelation of Marsh's betrayal and the incoming federal investigation, had arrived at the board session with a recommendation of their own. They wanted an independent security audit firm brought in on a permanent basis. They wanted external oversight of the internal network team. They wanted, in short, a visible and credible response that demonstrated institutional accountability. These were not unreasonable things to want. Isabella had said so, and had meant it. What they had also wanted, and this was where the conversation had turned, was to quietly attribute the breach's containment to the rapid response of the internal security team, not to the documentation of a contracted janitorial worker who had identified the vulnerabilities weeks earlier and been ignored. It creates liability, one of the directors, a man named Howard Prentice, had explained. His tone was the particular tone of people who believed they were being practical. Howard had been on the board for 4 years. He was not a malicious person. He was a person who had spent his career learning to smooth over the things that created friction, and who had eventually stopped noticing the difference between friction that was inconvenient and friction that was true. If it becomes public that a member of the cleaning crew identified a critical breach that our security team missed, the insurance implications alone, what you're describing, Isabella had said, is dishonest. What I'm describing is prudent. It's dishonest, Howard. She had used his name, which she did rarely, and only when she wanted the person to understand that she was speaking to them directly and not to the room. And it's also wrong, and it is the kind of thing that, when it eventually becomes known, and it will become known, because the truth of what happened that night is documented across 14 separate camera feeds and 3 independent systems, will be significantly worse for this company than the original breach. Howard had looked at her the way people look when they understand that the argument has shifted from pragmatics to character, and that they are not winning. There had been 3 hours of this. She had driven home at 9 p.m., and sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water she did not drink, and thought about the birds in the hospital waiting room, and about Marcus Hale sitting in a chair that was too small, holding a book he wasn't reading, waiting to hear how his daughter's heart was doing. She thought about what he had said in the server room, working beside Claire Stanton while the breach was being contained, not the technical explanations, but the way he said them. Precisely, patiently, with no trace of condescension toward a team that had missed what he had found. He had made it easy for them to receive what he was telling them. He had spent his whole career making it easy for people to receive the truth, and they had rewarded him for it by making his life very difficult. She thought about who she wanted to be. She thought about the 11 years she had spent building a company on the principle that the quality of a person's thinking was not determined by the position they held, the degree they carried, or the office they occupied. She had said this in interviews. She had put it in the company charter. She had believed it, and had sometimes remembered to act on it, and had sometimes forgotten. Marcus had not forgotten. He had never had the luxury. She called Dana at 9:40. "I need the full staff assembly room booked for 9 a.m. tomorrow," she said. "And I need Marcus Hale's contact information." "I already have it flagged," Dana said. Dana, who anticipated everything, who had been watching this situation unfold with the quiet attention of someone who had worked for Isabella long enough to understand when something important was happening. "Should I send him a car?" Yes, Isabella said. Please. 412 employees gathered in the Vaughn Dynamics Assembly Hall the next morning. They had been told only that the CEO had a company-wide announcement. The speculation in the hallways had been, according to Dana, considerable. Isabella walked to the front of the room. Marcus stood near the back, in the same gray sweatshirt he'd worn the night of the breach. He had been told nothing about why he was there. She had written the remarks 3 times and thrown them out 3 times. She was speaking without notes. 4 days ago, she said, Vaughn Dynamics was the target of a sophisticated internal breach. I want to tell you exactly what happened and exactly how it was stopped. She told them everything. Marcia's betrayal, the hardware bridge, the 6-week mirror. She told them about the notebook. She told them about the engineering credentials and the Clearwater case and the 40-month gap in Marcus Hale's career that had begun when he told the truth and nobody chose to listen. Mr. Hale identified every critical vulnerability in our network infrastructure weeks before anyone else. He documented them precisely and completely. He attempted to report them through normal channels and was dismissed. She paused. He was dismissed because his uniform said janitor and not engineer. And we made the assumption that these things meant different things about the quality of his observation. The room was very quiet. I made that assumption, she said. I want to say that plainly, because it is true, and because I have spent a great deal of time in this building, talking about the importance of evaluating people by the quality of their thinking, rather than the title on their badge, and I failed to do it, when it mattered, for the person in this room, who was doing the clearest thinking of anyone. She found Marcus at the back of the room. He was looking at the floor. We are going to do better, she said. This company was not destroyed because of what happened 4 days ago. It was not destroyed because we were honest about it. We will be stronger because of both. After the assembly, she walked to where Marcus was standing. He looked up. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did, she said. There's something else I want to talk to you about. Privately, if you're willing. They met in her office on the 43rd floor that afternoon. The afternoon light came through at an angle, the same sideways light that Lily called the golden hour. Isabella noticed this and filed it away somewhere. I'd like to offer you a position, she said. Director of Network Security Infrastructure. It's a new role. I'm restructuring the security division. The reporting chain would be directly to the CTO and to me. Marcus sat across from her, his hands folded on his knees. I want to be honest about what the role actually is, she continued. It's not a symbolic gesture. I need someone who is going to look at this building the way you looked at it from every angle, including the ones that make the most senior people in the room uncomfortable. I need someone who will write things down when they notice something wrong, and not stop until someone listens. You're offering me this because you feel you owe me something, he said. It was not an accusation. It was a question he needed answered honestly, before he could consider anything else. Partly, she said. I won't pretend that's not true. But if that were the only reason, I would offer you a settlement and an apology, and call it even. I'm offering you this because Claire Stanton told me that in 4 hours in the server room, you covered more ground than her team's last 18 months of auditing. Because the notebook you kept for 8 months while working a night shift in order to maintain your daughter's health insurance contains more actionable intelligence about this company's infrastructure than any external security review we have ever commissioned. And because the person I need in this role is someone who will not be impressed by authority when authority is wrong. Marcus was quiet for a while. The salary, he said finally, is commensurate with the responsibility of the position. Dana has the details. Lily's surgery. The company's executive health package covers 100% of covered procedure costs for dependents. The surgery would be fully covered. He looked out the window. The city was doing its ordinary afternoon things, 43 floors below the traffic. The pedestrians, the ordinary indifferent motion of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this room. I was wrong before, he said. Not about what I found at Clearwater. I was right about that. But I was wrong about how to exist in a place where people had decided not to listen to me. I kept thinking the answer was to get more proof. He paused. It took a long time to understand that the problem wasn't the proof. The problem was that proof isn't enough when the structure of the place is built to ignore certain people. I know, Isabella said. Can you actually change that? Here? I don't know, she said. But I know I can try harder than I have, and I know that having you in a position where your assessments carry institutional weight, rather than being at the mercy of whether someone decides to listen to the janitor, that's a start. Marcus looked at her for a long time. The careful eyes that had watched her from the corridor for months were doing the same thing they had always been doing. She realized reading the situation precisely, holding back judgment until the evidence warranted it. I'll need to talk to Lily, he said. Of course. She'll want to know about the office. She's going to want to come see it. Something moved across his face, the complicated, brief thing that was becoming his version of a smile. She's never been in a building this tall. Tell her she can see the lake from this floor on clear days, Isabella said. The federal indictment of Gregory Marsh was filed 6 weeks after the breach. The charges included wire fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets. His attorney released a statement calling the charges overreaching. The statement was not widely believed. The joint venture partners, after 2 weeks of carefully worded communications and one in-person meeting, at which Isabella had presented a complete account of the breach, its cause, and the reforms already underway, chose to continue the partnership. One of the partners, a deputy director at a federal infrastructure agency named Robert Ashby, had told Isabella afterward that the transparency had been the deciding factor. We expected you to minimize it, he said. The fact that you didn't was worth more than any security audit. Isabella had not told him about the board meeting, or about Howard Prentice, or about the 3 hours she had spent deciding who she wanted to be. Some things were private, but she had thought about it often, in the way that decisions made at the edge of your actual character tend to stay with you, not with guilt, but with the particular gravity of moments when you found out something real about yourself. 6 months later, Marcus Hale's name was on an office door on the 41st floor, not the 43rd, where the executive suites were. He had specifically asked for 41, near the server rooms. Isabella had found this characteristic, and had said nothing except to arrange it. His door was open more often than it was closed. Claire Stanton, who was now his deputy, had stopped by his office on his 3rd day to tell him she was working on a proposal to overhaul the camera coverage on the 38th floor blind spot. She had been thinking about it for months, she said. She had not known who to bring it to. He had told her to write it up, and he would take it to the CTO by Friday. She had looked at him with an expression he recognized, because he had worn it himself, the expression of someone discovering that the path from noticing a problem to someone doing something about it did not have to be as long and as difficult as they had learned to expect. He had worked on not saying too much in response. It was not the moment for a speech. It was the moment to let her go write the proposal. Lily came to the building on a Saturday in March, 3 weeks after her surgery, when she was well enough to be excited about things again. She wore a yellow coat and carried a stuffed dog named Captain and stood at the window of his office for 11 minutes, looking at the lake. It looks like the whole world, she said. Pretty much, Marcus agreed. Is that your chair? That's my chair. She considered this with the serious attention of an 8-year-old evaluating important information. It's a good chair, she said. She turned from the window and walked the perimeter of the room with the deliberate inspection of someone taking inventory. She examined the whiteboard, which had a network architecture diagram on it that she studied with her head tilted to one side. She examined the bookshelf, which held 6 technical manuals and a framed photograph of herself from 2 Christmases ago, the one where she was laughing at something off camera, and her eyes were nearly closed. She examined the door, which had his name on a small placard, and ran her finger over the letters. Does it feel different? She said. Being here instead of... She paused, constructing the sentence carefully the way she always did. Being here during the day? Marcus thought about this honestly, the way she expected him to. Some, he said. The building feels the same. The work feels more like what I'm supposed to be doing. He paused. The coffee is better. That's important, Lily agreed seriously. Down the hall, Isabella's office was empty. She had spent Saturday mornings in the building her whole career. but she had recently begun leaving at noon on Saturdays, a small change that Dana had noticed and not commented on, understanding that some changes were private and mattered precisely because they were. But she had left a note on the whiteboard outside Marcus's office, in her precise handwriting, where anyone passing could read it. "Welcome to the team. You were always part of it. I.V." Marcus did not move the note for 3 weeks. When he eventually erased it to make room for the updated network audit schedule, he had already decided that the thing it represented the particular act of someone choosing, finally, to put into writing, the thing that should have been said much earlier was not something he needed to preserve on a whiteboard. He had his notebook for the things that mattered. He always had. And he always would. The notebook was on his desk, now a new one. The old one having been submitted as evidence in the federal investigation. He had bought a replacement the same day. Same brand, same wire binding. Some habits were worth keeping exactly as they were. Isabella was in the elevator one Tuesday evening in April, when a new member of the facilities staff stepped in beside her young, barely 20, carrying a mop and looking at the floor in the slightly braced way of someone who had learned that it was better to be invisible than to be noticed. She had seen this posture before. She had walked past it 100 times without recognizing it for what it was. Isabella looked at her. "Long shift?" she said. The woman looked up, startled, as though the question itself were unexpected. "Yes, ma'am. They'll give you a key card for the break room on 38, Isabella said. "The coffee is better than what's in the vending machines on the main floor. I should have put that on the new hire information sheet." The elevator reached the lobby. Isabella stepped out first. Behind her, the facilities worker stood for a moment before stepping out too, into the ordinary life of the building, which was the same building it had always been, and wasn't. Some people keep the building standing not because anyone asked them to, but because they cannot look at something broken and choose to walk away. The notebook was never about leverage. It was never about ambition. It was the record of a person paying attention, in the dark, in the quiet, with no audience, and no reward, because paying attention was simply what he did. That is rarer than any title suggests. That is worth more than any floor you happen to work on.